third in our series on law, policy, and inequality. I'm Eddie Webster, and I'm from the Southern Center of Inequality Studies, and we share this seminar with Professor Firas Kachalia, who's from the Mandela Institute, and Professor Kathy Albertine, who has a special chair on law and inequality. Our topic for today is inequality and indebtedness. In our last session, my colleague Arup Chatterjee from the Southern Center of Inequality Studies presented the results of his research on wealth inequality. Quite a pioneering research where he and his colleagues found that South Africans have an average net wealth of negative 16,000 Rand. This means that the assets are less than their liabilities. In other words, they're in debt. By comparison, the richest 10% of South Africans have on average net wealth of 2.8 million Rand, and the top 1% an average net wealth of 17.8 million. So this is the background on which I'm going to invite our keynote speaker, Professor Deborah James, who is Professor of Anthropology at the London School of Economics. She previously lectured at Wits. Welcome back, Deborah, to Wits. I remember well your early research on women migrant workers and the songs of the women migrant workers. In fact, it was a very exciting anthropology department at that time. You had Johnny Clegg, the late Johnny Clegg, who was beginning to grapple with his music while he was teaching anthropology. You had the late David Webster, who was establishing those links with community resistance, which in the event proved fatal. It was an exciting time, and it's great to have you back at Wits, even if only in virtual form. When Deborah left Wits in 1998, she retained her interest in South Africa, and in 2007, she produced a book, Gaining Ground on Land Reform. And in 2015, she published Money from Nothing, Indebtedness and Aspiration in South Africa. In this classic book, she explores the contradictory dynamics surrounding South Africa's national project of financial inclusion. Now, the aim of that is to extend credit to Black South Africans as a critical aspect of Black economic empowerment. And the book captures the lived experience of debt for the many millions who are struggling to improve their lives. With those introductory remarks, I'd like to invite Professor James to present her PowerPoint.
Thank you very much. It's great to be back at Wits in these days where online you can be anywhere you like. I'm quite sad that I haven't been able to give back to South Africa since April, but anyway, I guess this is as close as I'm going to get. So I don't know if any of you read the stuff that Eddie and Kathy sent around. Since I wrote my book, which is based on research conducted in the kind of mid 2000s, I have kind of tried to do a little bit more work, and I'm going to report a bit back on what I've been doing more recently. And a couple of years ago, I came out to South Africa and tried to find out some of the things that have been happening since my book was published, specifically relating to law cases that had been held and decided upon in the interim period. And so I owe a lot here to the people I've spoke to, which include Odette, who's kindly, sharing, being a commentator today. Also, Stefan van der Merwe of the University of Stellenbosch Law Clinic. And then in addition to that, people from the private sector, specifically from Summit Financial Services, a guy called Clark Gardner, who played quite a big role in these various court cases, and some of the people who work in his organization, in addition to the Black Sash, which is where I've recently been doing some research. So I'm kind of reporting back on a few of these more recent findings. And so let me just start off by briefly giving a little bit of context. Let me see. Okay, how do we get on here? Sorry, I'm just trying to, yeah. Sorry, so this is just a little bit of context from other authors who've been writing up on the facts of indebtedness in the global South, showing that South African sort of poor people in South Africa are not alone in this respect, and they've given a couple of pointers as to why the current sort of phenomenon has come about, and financialization certainly plays its role in those things. But there's a very sort of poignant quote here from an author called Ariel Wilkes, who's written about Argentina and about slum dwellers in Buenos Aires, in terms of which he says, poor people, a woman there said to him, "We don't have money, but we do have debt." In other words, an indication that a lot of people in different parts of the South have started relying on debt literally as part of their household budget, often quite in a calculated manner, rather than just sort of profligately borrowing wherever they can do so. Okay. And so, yeah, these are the kinds of phenomena which have, in a sense, according to Seva and Sayag, led to, in part, to the kind of indebtedness that we're currently experiencing. So in kind of looking back at this phenomenon and at the situation that we find ourselves in, I think we've still got this key conundrum, which I pretty much laid out in my original book. And that is that, well, in South Africa, specifically partly because of the sort of political, the democratic transition, people want to borrow, and they specifically want to borrow more than they might have done previously, having been sort of cut out of access to credit. But unfortunately, because of that, their need puts them into the hands of unscrupulous operators. And so part of what I'm documenting today is the way in which various activists and lawyers, including Odette, in fact, have kind of fought a running battle against these unscrupulous operators. And the question then becomes, are we talking only about strange, oddball kind of crooks on the sidelines, or are we talking about something much more endemic and much more sort of categorical, a kind of widespread form of capitalism, albeit one that has found its way into what you might call the ranks of the poor because of this whole financial inclusion phenomenon? And then in turn, once the lawyers and advisors and activists have tried to close certain routes, the creditors have found new workarounds. And it has been argued that financial inclusion is something that enables this smooth and seamless transfer of money, and specifically in cases where the population is in fact very widely banked, which is the case in South Africa, especially since the kind of wide remit of social grants that have been given out. So the two things I'm going to briefly talk about relate, first of all, to the court case that was in which Odette played a big role. That was the one in the Constitutional Court, which happened in relation to garnishee orders, and then more recently the whole phenomenon around social grants being used as collateral. And just to then talk about this other side of the screen here, you've got creditors always claiming making a counterclaim when they're being criticized and saying, well, people need credit and we're giving it to them. And there's a claim that too much regulation, for example, closing off the routes to emolument attachment orders, garnishee orders as they were called and still are called, will put them, the creditors, out of business, which will mean that poor people will have no option but to go and borrow from loan sharks. So there's always this kind of moral self-justification. We're doing good for the poor because if it wasn't for us, these poor people would be driven into some far more egregious type of lending. And that is the fundamental conundrum, which I think we still haven't really found our way out of. Okay, this is just a quote from Stefan van der Merwe, who is in the Stellenbosch Law Clinic, or was when I spoke to him last. And he sort of puts at, in a sense, the very crucial question forward, which is, and we're talking here about a vast range of poor people who are having to borrow probably quite small amounts in many cases. A lot of them think they're massively in debt, but they're actually each in debt maybe to the tune of not very much, but it all adds up, of course. And what Stefan pointed out is there is a central question which nobody seems to have managed to really sort out, and that is, how much is it legitimately possible for a lender to take off in the way of interest? Now, although in fact it's clear in law, because there's an in duplum rule, which some of you may probably know more about than I do, which says you can never charge more than double the principal. The fact is that there's always the possibility left open of charging things that are not called interest, things like collection fees, administration fees, additional fees, initiation fees, and a whole range of things of that kind. And so this has been one of the loopholes which the creditors that I've mentioned have been exploiting. Now, in my book, I laid out what appeared to me at the time to be a fairly sort of clear-cut, what you might call tripartite set of lending sectors. The first one was the one mainly dominated by English-speaking capitalists, from which Black people had long been excluded, but were now suddenly being included. The second, mainly Afrikaans-speaking former civil servants, and finally informal mashonistas or lenders in Black communities. I've since had to revise my opinion on this, but bear with me for the moment. That was the way I laid it out in the first place. Excuse me. And this is just to kind of illustrate the type of lenders that we're talking about and the way in which this is often done. So you've got sector one, which includes things like store cards, regular banks, but of course also famously, or rather infamously in the case of South Africa, huge furniture conglomerates, which for, you know, in any small kind of high-felt town where I used to do my fieldwork, there'd be probably 10 of these selling goods to people on hire purchase and usually creaming off a huge profit in the process, charging usually more than double what it should have done. Now, so much for this mainstream sector. Now, the first case that I'm going to describe here, which is the court case that Odette presided at, which is the University of Stellenbosch Legal Aid Clinic and 15 others versus the Minister of Justice and 17 others. And the people that we're talking about are actually laid out on the screen there. You can see from their names that they're quite dodgy operators in the first place. But what I discovered on speaking to the various people that I discussed this with was that the kind of whole lending model has pretty much changed in the interim. And that is because, as Stefan van der Merwe explained to me, people take out cash loans. They go along to a company like Joshua, or they go to Lewis, etc. They sign documents thinking that they're entering a hire purchase agreement, but then in fact, there's a whole kind of shenanigan going on whereby the company like JD Finance sits behind and incurs a loan on behalf of the client. So what seems to be about borrowing money, in effect, to buy a piece of furniture turns into a loan agreement, which they didn't even know that they were signing up to. And that is really where all of these strange-sounding companies came into the frame. So, and the kind of key point to note here is that the loans have always been described here as unsecured, but to a large extent they are not unsecured. And that is because of the fact that at the time it was very easy for any of these lenders or surrogate lenders or debt collectors on behalf of other lenders to go and get an emoluments attachment order through which they could immediately start withdrawing automatically money from the debtor's bank account. And it is this which in fact has been curbed to a very large extent by the effects of that court case, for which I think one can only really be extremely grateful. These are just a couple of the things I came across because I looked through the documents. They're all stored in the University of Stellenbosch Law Clinic. This is an emoluments attachment order that had been countersigned. It had been prepared in advance, naming the person in question by one of these debt collectors to whom the loan had been sold and then resold again. This person is called Jan Hendrik van Aswegen. He went along, and this is the kind of thing that was going on. It was all involving this company called Bridge Corporate, and there was just sort of intermediaries, and it's something that makes the subprime mortgage crisis sound almost benign by comparison. And these are just documents, again, showing you how quite a small loan initially taken out accrues and accrues over time to something absolutely unbelievable, and certainly in excess of double the amount. This is just an infographic that was prepared at the time, sort of showing how these different associations, this bridge loans company was connected up to Flemix and Associate, who were the debt collectors that were operating on behalf of all these other companies to go in and get these emoluments attachment orders. And this is a quote from Clark Gardner showing how, in fact, this all turned into an extremely lucrative investment vehicle. As he points out here, it sort of sounds too good to be true. There was 19% per annum return, adverts on TV, rugby players as ambassadors. But as soon as it was challenged in court and it became evident that these garnishee orders was a completely invalid system of deductions, we had now the counter deductions going on. And this then brought an end to the whole thing. So it was when, in fact, the Constitutional Court ruled, it was actually quite a sort of narrow victory in one sense, because there were really two smallish areas in which the Constitutional Court ruled that this could no longer go on. One was in terms of the actual area where you could take a person to court and get one of these emoluments attachment orders processed. What they discovered was that the people that these lenders had been going to the courts that were known to be complicit in being able to do this and avoid the ones where it wasn't. So they were just, it was like a business. It was an incredible business process going on, and that was ruled illegal. And secondly, it then became necessary for everybody who did, in fact, issue an order like this, had to go through a court rather than just being signed off on by the clerk of the court. So although these sounded like quite small victories, they in fact did turn out to be absolutely groundbreaking. And here you can just see a couple of the newspaper reports that celebrated the end of that court case. And interestingly, what has happened in the interim is that what I'm calling counter deductions, and also called counter deductions in my article, show that various things have sort of come about as a result of this. For example, the central firm at the heart of all this, Flemix and Associates, were eventually in 2019 being taken before a disciplinary hearing. There was a judicial review which was made ultimately necessary for every single garnishee order to be properly inspected by the magistrates. This then had the effect of making many, many creditors scared of trying to go through the emolument attachment order route and instead use other systems, not necessarily better ones, but certainly far less automated, far less sort of technocratic in their character. The Magistrates Court, as Odette has kindly informed me, did finally, the Magistrates Court Act was finally rewritten to encompass this new set of regulations. And there was, in fact, and many people have written about this, a reduction in the use of emoluments attachment orders or garnishee orders. And it also became quite evident to many big employers, including the mining companies, because you might remember that at Marikana, large numbers of the people who struck at Marikana and were ultimately, many of whom were killed in that awful incident, were terribly in debt, and they were all having their salaries taken out straight after payday using these garnishee orders. So big employers got on board and started started worrying about what was happening. And eventually a Credit Amendments Act was passed as well. Okay, so in effect, what I'm showing you here is that these court cases, although in this particular case, it seemed like a fairly small thing addressing two very specific kind of items, really did have important effects. So the counter deductions were very important. What I discovered on speaking to what I discovered on speaking to the employees at Clark Gardner and other people at his firm was that a number of big employers were starting to become very worried about this kind of phenomenon. And in one case, for example, a law firm called Staines Attorneys in the Northern Province was taken to court. There was a High Court application involving Lonman, Amplatz, the Treasury, and Q-Link, which is Clark Gardner's company. And as you can see here, there was a large number of dodgy people, lending companies, etc., involved. As it happens, the case was turned down on a technicality, but as you can see, it's like a continual arms race. You know, one kind of phenomenon is shut down and another then immediately gets taken up as an option. And in addition, another part of the so-called arms race that I found out about speaking to some of the people who work for Clark Gardner and Summit Financial was that even though it was now very difficult, and in fact many creditors were fighting shy of trying to use the garnishee order system, there were fake garnishee orders being issued. And in this particular case, as one of the people at Summit told me, there were government employees who were having emolument attachment orders deducted from their payslip. And the people who'd set up sort of companies in order to do this had literally forged the stamps and all the rest of it, and were issuing these forged documents and then taking them to the magistrate's court. That was in Zanani, and the magistrate was honoring these, and then the employers were paying them out. So as I say, it's like you sort of close one door and then a whole new set of doors gets explored by these people trying to utilize the system of garnishee or emolument attachment orders. But nevertheless, as I pointed out before, it definitely did move in the right direction. And this is just another case that I found out about. In this particular case, it was a matter of debt collectors. And again, this was post the Constitutional Court's case, forcing people into doing things, sort of signing up to something which you think you're doing for one thing, and actually then you discover that you've had a debit order being put on your account of 450 and then 99 Rand per month for the rest of the year. So as you can see, a large amount of sort of crazy stuff. And as I was saying at the very beginning, it's interesting to me to note whether we're talking here just about sort of maverick kind of Wild West capitalism operating at the fringes of society, or whether this is something far more endemic, which needs to be tackled at source. So, so the second thing that I've been looking into and actually got involved in terms of a research project more recently has been going in with some other people doing some research for the Black SCIS, which has long been a very important sort of actor on challenging issues of indebtedness, initially just in a general sense, and more recently specifically around the social grants. Now, I'm sure that most of you will be very much aware of the whole scandal that emerged when Net1 and its various sort of subsidiaries, Moneyline and the rest, were given the contract to deliver social grants around the country, which, you know, arguably they had excellent capacity to do, and therefore it was almost a no-brainer to have that possible. But then were in fact enabling their subsidiaries to sell loans to people. Once again, the idea here, pretty much as in the case of the emoluments attachments, was that this was unsecured lending, and therefore that the lender was sort of doing a favor to the borrower, because these borrowers would not be in any other way enabled to borrow money. But just as in the case of emoluments attachment orders, this was not the case. In the case of the garnishee orders, the debtor's salary, especially in the case of civil servants, was a completely reliable sort of source of collateral, and therefore it wasn't unsecured at all. In this case, the social grants represent a completely reliable source of collateral, and therefore, again, the lenders are not taking any risk. So just to briefly go through a couple of the points that we found out in this second piece of research, which in fact is supposed to be, it was going to be launched in April, and of course the virus came along. We're now going to be doing it in September, hopefully on September the 10th. So this is a kind of sneak preview I'm giving you here. We did the research in a bunch of sort of rural and peri-urban sites around the country. Mine were up in the former Transvaal, Hammanskraal, Taaiboschroet right up by the border, Kutsong. Those are the three that I was looking into. And once again, to just remind you of my original set of sort of subdivision of types of lenders, which I thought at the time I kind of laid it out and it all seemed fairly neat and tidy. You had the formal financial sector, then you had the new micro-lending sector, and finally these informal sort of mashonistas who used people's cards, took people's cards away and used them at the ATM to get their loans back. And what we discovered in our new piece of research with the Black Sash was a far more complicated typology of types of lenders and lending, challenging the notion that the sort of formal lending and informal lending can be, you know, neatly packaged and separated off from each other. So we ended up with this quite complicated model in which we looked specifically at the way in which the loans are transferred to the borrower from the lender. So you've got these three sort of categories along the top. The first one roughly corresponds to what you might call more formal sector lending, and it particularly includes Easy Pay Everywhere Moneyline, i.e. the thing originally facilitated by Net1. Incidentally, what we discovered in our research was that far more people were still using the Net1 cards and the Easy Pay Everywhere cards than was alleged to be the case, and this was largely because of the fact that so many pay points had been decommissioned, and therefore people felt they had no option but to stick with the original grants distributor. Plus, a lot of them actually wanted to carry on borrowing from Moneyline, which was the subsidiary of Net1. In the middle, we had a whole new kind of phenomenon of lending, which I will go on to in the next slide. But effectively, a lot of these are called the Chinese lenders. And I'll show you a picture in the next slide of the enormous number of these that have proliferated around the country. These more or less are equivalent to what we call here in England payday lenders. So you can take out money and you've got to pay it back straight away in the next month. And yeah, it's usually kind of excessive rates of interest, but in theory, it's all kind of written off in that kind of time frame. And finally, you get what I initially put as the informal lenders and borrowers, and this is the cash sort of thing on the edge there. And this includes a range of different kinds of so-called loan sharks. What we did was we kind of calibrated them from what you might call more socially close ones on the one side of the diagram through to the much more sort of socially distanced ones on the other side. Now, although these are often thought of as community lenders, and sometimes people express their gratitude to these lenders and say how indebted they are to them, you know, literally, but also in a more sort of figurative sense, what we discovered was that there's a very subtle range, and this is where a point comes through which I made in my original book, and that is that you cannot always very easily distinguish borrowers from lenders. Because in the case of these mashonistas, of these so-called loan sharks, the people that you will often find lending the money are actually members of stokvels or savings clubs who are obliged, because they are a member of a savings club, to lend out the money at interest. That's the way the stokvel operates. So they're looking out for people to borrow from them, usually on fairly negotiable terms, as we discovered, and therefore couldn't really be regarded as the most sort of egregious lenders out there. Then on the other hand, some of the people borrowing from those mashonistas are themselves members of stokvels who feel obliged to borrow money so that they can pay their stokvel back. So part of this whole neighborhood kind of lending savings club phenomenon, which has often been thought of in quite a sort of positive way, is itself a source of borrowing and lending, and often has driven people into problems. This is just a few pictures, and I'm saying it's only a few, of the amazing proliferation of so-called one-time lenders. And these are the Chinese, as they're called. Some of these come from Carltonville, some of them are from Hammanskraal. There is an incredible number of these out there. And as I said before, they all have these systems where they will give you cash, but on the other hand, they'll be taking the money out of your bank account, and they'll take it out in one fell swoop. Actually, there are abuses on this one as well. Sometimes you'll find a person has been having money deducted from their bank accounts 2 or 3 times in a row, and until they finally spot it, the money just goes. So, you know, even though it's sort of semi-formalized, it also has many abuses. And this is just a diagram from the forthcoming report that we have brought out, sort of showing how these one-time loans actually operate. You have to have your Easy Pay card. That's the only way you're going to get one of these loans. The loans are given in cash, paid back through a debit order. They are registered with the National Credit Registry, and this raises questions as to just how effective that registry actually is. And they do appear to have a sort of centralized command structure somewhere in the background, although we were never really able to find out too much about how they operate. But as you can see here, you've got your original loan amount, you've got your interest, which is strictly within the limits, but then you've got your initiation fee, your service fee, and you've got all these kind of additional factors, which goes back to Stefan van der Merwe's original question. How much are you legitimately allowed to charge in interest, and how much then ends up being these sort of additional add-ons? So there's just a little, I won't go through the whole story here, but what I did discover in the particular place that I was doing the research, which was this place, Taiboshkrut, near the Zimbabwean border, was that instead of it being a matter of either people borrow from more formal lenders under more kind of reasonable rates, or otherwise they're going to be driven into the hands of loan sharks, a person like this one here, Kate, we've given her a pseudonym, was actually borrowing from both. And the Mashonisa, the loan shark, was the one who had extremely sort of hard to understand terms and conditions. He wrote it down in an exercise book. He'd often come and take the card from her by force, as you can see at the bottom in the story down there. But she and others like her were both borrowing from Easy Pay Everywhere, from Moneyline, and borrowing from the other lenders as well. So it wasn't a matter of either or, it was both and. And this is partly, as I said before, because of the fact that people need more money than they can get. The child support grants, in this particular case, a woman called Mpho, do not equate to anything that you could live on. In this case, the woman's got 3 child support grants totaling 1,260, and she's paying back 3 loans. One of them is to Easy Pay Everywhere, and it's got papers and it's kind of all documented, and the others are to 2 Mashonisas. And they're kind of quite carefully calculated, just like in the case of the woman that I mentioned right at the beginning from Buenos Aires. She uses the one set of loans to sort of buy stuff every 6 months, usually sort of new school uniforms for her children around Christmas time, other stuff around July. So it's a completely regularized scenario. And of course, the terms offered are much lower than what the Mashonisa will charge. But then in addition, it could be that she has a sort of additional expense. It could be something like needing to go to the doctor, which is what happened to her, having to get a taxi to the local town, having to pay the doctor, etc. So in a sense, she combines both of these. Now, it's not to say that this is a benign system at all. It's actually a very difficult system. And it's becoming increasingly difficult, as people used to do, to sort of ring fence your money in one sort of place and allocate it to one thing while, you know, allocating another amount to something else. There's a certain kind of sense of confusion. And as you can see at the bottom, she said she was unable to calculate her total outgoings. She said, if you could remember that amount of money, you would get a heart attack. Now, it's quite a depressing story, really, when you think about it. But just to show you that there is no easy kind of division between the so-called formal and the informal sector. So right at the end, I don't know where I've got to time-wise, but right at the end, sorry, I think I've gone slightly over. But anyway, these are just some recommendations that we came out with at the end. And many of them are very difficult to implement, partly because enforcement, especially in these rural areas, is really hard. But one of the ones that I have been quite keen on, especially having done some research on debt advice here in Britain, is the fact that lenders themselves ought to fund debt advice. And they do here in Britain. There's a sort of mandatory levy, if you are a bank or any other kind of creditor, that you have to pay. And it's called polluter pays, because you are the polluter. you are the kind of person exacting, profits from poor people, and you have to then pay to fund debt advice. So I think that's one of the things which it would be great if it could be done. But if you want to know more, you can come along to our report launch in September. Okay, thank you. I'll stop sharing now.
Right, thank you very much, Deborah, for that fascinating account of those court cases that have tried to kind of regulate the credit and the degree of indebtedness. I'm going to move to straight away to our two discussants, and then after they have spoken, we're going to open up for questions and answers. So you'll have time to answer now. I'm going to firstly introduce Odette Geldenes. Odette is an attorney in the broad field of public interest law. She has a distinguished career as a champion of justice and was the instructing attorney in the Stellenbosch Legal Aid Clinic case, which won the case on the garnishee orders that Deborah has outlined in her lecture. Odette has an LLB from Wits, and she will speak first. And then, but before I ask you to speak, Odette, let me just introduce our second discussant, Dr. Mohammed. Siraj Mohammed is Deputy Director of the South African Parliamentary Budget Office in Cape Town. He has a long-standing interest in the impact of financialization on the economy and has taught at Wits at the University of the Western Cape and at the Global Labour University, where he ran for many years the course on economics in their master's program. He has degrees in economics from UCT, from Wits, and an MA and PhD from the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. And he will be our second discussant. Over to you, Odette.
Great. Thanks, Eddie, and good afternoon to everyone. Just want to start with just two remarks. And Deborah, you were asking the rhetoric question: is it a few maverick cowboys out there? And it really is. It's really not that. It really is deep unemployment, deep poverty, and our massive income inequality in South Africa. That in South Africa causes that is the ground for. I'm so glad you shared those photographs of what it really looks like, those where people go and get money. And that is the one response. And then you also had the photograph of my uncle in the furniture business. And part of what I do is I give workshops on indebtedness to poor people and how they can try and get out of it. And so I always ask them, so what's your own particular situation? And they start off being very shy and then eventually warm up. And being based in Cape Town, speak Afrikaans, and then people warm up. And at the one workshop, the woman explained to me how she handled the situation. She had had a cupboard from, it might have been Joshua Doe, it might have been Lewis Stores, and she had paid off, and obviously the cupboard had turned into 3 times more than what she thought it was going to cost. She kept on paying. Eventually it was about $100 left to pay, and she just felt like, I've paid enough on this cupboard, and just phone calls, SMSs, she wasn't going to pay the 100 Rand further. Until she got the call to say, we are on our way to fetch the cupboard. And so she said, and Odette, you know what I did then? I took the axe and I axed the cupboard. And so there was no cupboard for Joshua Doe to fetch when they arrived at her house. And I just quite liked that story as being I'm not supposed to say I like that story as a lawyer, but I did like that story. So just, I want to just, Deborah's really highlighted the main aspects of the Stellenbosch University legal clinic case. I just wanted to highlight a few aspects of that case, and then why it was important, but also why the legal route is not the solution to the problem of income inequality, poverty, and unemployment. So, we had 15 working people in Stellenbosch, and they were, the situation was they had expenditure and expenses that they needed to meet through these loans. And I think that, while that was a particular company, Bridge Finance, the same system still applies, and that even though the National Credit Act prohibits the extension of reckless credit in Section 80 of the Act, this is what happens on a daily basis. And so, as I understand it, there are some countries where it's possible to have a national database where that can be, so where one has, now we have a blacklisting system. That system can be expanded to capture the credit that people have taken, or the loans that people have taken out, so that it would be easy for any second or third lender to go into that system. So I don't think that is impossible to do, but yeah, that would be one way of doing it. And so the interesting thing, I think, for us when we started off with the emolument attachment order case, or the garnishee case, is that what was happening was, it was happening by the book. It was happening in terms of the Magistrates Court Act. So the Magistrates Court Act itself allowed for, and Deborah actually had the one form that allowed for the debtor to sign a form that said, I hereby consent that I owe money to Polkadot or Maravedi. And once that form had been signed, that then was a judgment debt. So, unlike rich people who go to court and then eventually concede, and then they concede to a judgment debt, here this was done by a signature on a form, which then went to a clerk of the court, and didn't have a magistrate to say, well, do you really consent that you are owing 2,000 Rand? Where did the 2,000 Rand come from? And the other issue that was more a confusion in the way in which the Magistrates Court Act was written was that it allowed for a debtor to also in writing consent to the jurisdiction of any magistrate's court. And so that is what many of the creditors and the attorneys who used the system of garnishee orders or emolument attachment orders as the debt collecting mechanism, that's what they use, so that form would be part of the pack of when the loan is made. And so what happened in this case is that we could actually see how that section of the act was then abused, so that in our case, all our clients were based in Stellenbosch, living and working in Stellenbosch, but they all had signed, and maybe I'll go back to the number of applicants in the case, but they'd all signed a form consenting to the jurisdiction of magistrates courts in Kimberley, Bloemfontein, really literally thousands of kilometers away from Stellenbosch. So by the time that these forms reached not even the magistrate in Kimberley or Bloemfontein, but reached the clerk of the court. And they somehow realized that there's now something happening with them, about them, and their debt. There was no way that they were going to get to that part of the country so far away from Stellenbosch, which for you and me, it would be a small amount, a 2,000 or 3,000, maybe 4,000 Rand debt, and they could just not get to those courts to go and explain themselves to the clerk of the court. And so this concept in law is known as forum shopping, and it then allowed these credit providers, the debt collectors, and their attorneys to shop for and use magistrates' courts where they knew that the clerks of the court were very sympathetic to providing these emoluments attachment orders. And so I think the important part of this case was linking the issue of what was happening to poor people around the extension of credit and the debt collecting mechanism, and linking that to the Constitution. And so we were arguing that, and as Deborah said, that for these garnishee orders, the security that the lender has is that they only made loans to people who work, people who have a salary. And so the argument that we made is that a salary and income of a person is so fundamental to who they are, to their access to transport, their access to food, their access to education, that it cannot just be taken away in an unlawful way or an unprocedural way by a clerk of the court. And because of that reason, it has to go before a magistrate. And so, as Deborah said, the law has been changed, and emoluments attachment orders can now only be granted by a magistrate. I think my time is almost up, but before I hand over to Professor Mohammed, I wanted to just also mention two other areas where, in the same act, the Magistrates Court Act, there's also a concept of an administrator. And the National Credit Act has the concept of a debt counsellor, and they're about the same type of person. They are set up by different laws to assist poor people to kind of sort of before they reach a liquidation stage, to help them to manage their debts. But both those systems are seriously problematic. And I think finally it was touched upon that the National Credit Act has set up the National Credit Regulator, but certainly what we found, not only in our case, where the court, one of the very, very strong recommendations of the court to the National Credit Regulator was, please go and investigate this law firm that had advised its clients to use, to forum shop, to use strong arm tactics when it came to debt collecting. Please go and investigate that firm. And it's now 20 years later, and the National Credit Regulator has not done that. And yeah, similarly, other complaints, very significant systemic complaints. So it deals with, it deals with one-off issues quite readily, but it appears that the national credit regulator doesn't like to deal with systemic issues. Yeah, thank you very much.
Right. Thank you, Adet. I think we'll move straight forward to ask Siraj. Would you like to respond?
Yes, thank you, Eddie, and thank you, Deborah and Adet, for very informative discussions and comments. And to say I'm slightly thrown because I was expecting this on the legal side, but I was asked to sort of talk about economic implications. And the one thing, I mean, I'm a macroeconomist, so it's also, but I sort of don't really hold to the division between macro and micro that is within mainstream economics. So I try and look at things that happen on the ground and the kind of work that I think you guys are doing that are really important and hopefully can become more influential. And so it makes me think of, Minsky's got this idea that financial crises are part of a process of instability that's endemic to capitalist economies. And we often think about that as at a macro level. But if you look at the levels of poverty and inequality in South Africa, and you think about what's happening as everyday life becomes financialized and people are struggling to make a living and forced to go get these kind of loans you're talking about and getting themselves into this trouble, I think we're seeing a deepening crisis. And a crisis that's a national one. So it's not sort of a collapse of the financial sector because they're getting a kind of what we think of as sort of the classical Minsky moment. We're actually seeing at the very grassroots level a deepening of a crisis linked to this process of finance creating endogenously within this capitalist society a crisis within communities, within households, and part of the erosion of the social fabric. And within that, I mean, it draws me back and sort of thinking about, in my preparation of this, going back to Deborah's earlier book, I think it was a 2015 book, thinking through that context of the shift towards the transition to democracy and the shift and this sort of hope and aspiration, and think about aspirations as something that sort of cascades. Sort of very poor people have aspirations to have better lives. New public servants have aspirations to have better houses or cars, or send their kids to Model C or private schools, and seeing, this kind of pressure and hope and aspirations on people from the 1990s, and what happens in the economy, sort of crushing this kind of adoption of neoliberal policies by government, that affects their ability to increase the social wage, not provide the levels of services, and rejecting the basic income grant, for instance, not investing enough in health and education. And to some extent, the kind of privatization or semi-privatization, increased private provision of that. And also people having to, with things like pensions, insurance, and other things, having to take care of that, besides education and spending more on health and education themselves. So that's sort of putting these kinds of pressure, but at the same time, a process of deindustrialization that had started in the 80s, but is exacerbated with the trade liberalization in South Africa and choices made, and then the increased opening up of financial markets and allowing and choices with macroeconomic policies that allow financialization to happen at a broad level. One, with the increased hot money flows that drive certain kind of behavior within the South African financial sector, drives money towards speculation in asset markets, both financial and real estate asset markets. And during this period, before the global financial crisis, for instance, from 2003 to 2008, we saw that credit extension to the private sector grew by 22%, but gross fixed capital formation grew by only 4% of GDP as a percentage of GDP. If you look at what happened to household debt overall, now I'm sort of understand that, you know, the last data I looked at was 2013, but microfinance is only about 10%, I think, of total debt in the country. But I mean, if you look at what happened to households aggregate from Reserve Bank data, we see that, you know, around the time before the crisis, or the period before the crisis, 2002, debt to disposable income was about 52%. By 2008, after this large increase in credit extension, it grew to 86%. And then by 2019, I think after probably lots of effort and hard work, on aggregate, people had managed to bring that down to 73%. But what's interesting, and I think this links to the story, and it shows that the story affects not only the poorest, but also the middle class, and I think especially public sector workers, as Deborah spoke about today, and in previous work. If you look at what debt service costs as a percentage of disposable household income, in 2002, it was 7%. It grew to 13% by 2008. And we see people paying off their debt and their debt decreasing to 73% by 2019. But from 2011 through to the current period, we're seeing that debt service costs staying around 9 to 10% of disposable income. So even though people have paid down their debt by a fairly large amount, that their debt service costs are still high. And I think this is linked to that the earlier discussion. We're seeing more and more unsecured debt and a shift away from mortgage debt, leasing finance debt, those kinds of things, towards credit card debt. And then, I mean, again, that cascades down to the different kinds of debt and to the point where you're getting machinistas and stockpiles, and that raising an interesting of how the lack of economic opportunities, the lack of services, and having to replace or provide your own services and spend money on those kind of things, creating a condition where people, where even at a very local level, things like stockpiles become sort of sites of financialization, where basically people in stockpiles are borrowing to pay for their stockpiles, but they're also lending money that they get at the stockpiles as a way for income. And I've spoken a lot to my friend John Spiropoulos, who been working within certain townships and also been looking at, you know, especially young people. And the point he actually told me, and drawing on his dissertation work, is that, you know, more than half, he's got from 2015 data, about 3.2 million young adults are intermittently employed. This makes up more than half of at the time, half of the total employed, formally employed group of people. And this intermittent employment means that people don't have long-term secure paychecks. And that shapes their behavior. It shapes whether they stay in jobs, and a lot of these people are faced with pressures where they may choose to actually, and sometimes we refer to it as the black tax. You know, when you've got a job and a lot of people around you are unemployed, your families, your friends, there's a real pressure on you. And when you're not earning enough, or you don't have a stable enough employment, a kind of precarious livelihood, sometimes it makes sense to just withdraw from the labor market. And when you have got access to money, you're unable to make long-term plans. So you just spend that money, and when you have access to credit, you borrow and you spend that money, and you often don't get in trouble and don't think about how you get to repay that. So we're sort of sitting with I think, partly as a result of our legacy, partly as a result of the choices to follow a neoliberal framework, for economic thinking after 94, we're sitting in a situation where poverty and inequality is worse, and people have become much more reliant, and their daily lives have become financialized in this kind of very negative fashion. So that's sort of most of what I want to say. The other aspect of it is sort of thinking through, you know, how you get out of that. And as a kind of heterodox post-Keynesian Marxian economist, you know, a lot of that sort of changing the distributions of income, but also looking at it as a problem, a demand side problem. And a lot of people think about, especially in these discussions we're now having about the deficit and stimulus, you know, people think about demand side as a short-term problem, but in many countries, probably generally one can think of it like that, in developed as well, but in South Africa particularly, where you have such levels of poverty and inequality, you know, even if you could increase supply on the supply side, demand is a long-term problem. Demand is, you know, and we think about demand as what shapes accumulation, what shapes future innovation, productivity, etc. And so demand for me is a long-term problem for the South African economy. It's a deep problem, and it's something that you begin to solve, I think, by government shifting gears, changing gear in a sense, and investing much more in poor people and being much more distributive and putting in place the kind of improvements in quality of services, things like the basic income grant or job guarantee, and then thinking through what, you know, what that means for the future, and you know, and thinking about demand not only as this kind of thing we see on demand and supply curves in economics books, but see it as sort of being able to change how people have access to healthcare and education and what that means. And also, I suppose, as a heterodox economist, we talk about path dependency. And so often when people talk about the role of government in providing and stimulating the economy, we think about it as a budget to budget or medium-term budget framework. But here we talk about intergenerational things. If you're actually able to provide people with health and education in this, as children now, it makes a difference for what the economy sees in 25, 30 years' time. And that also goes for access to credit and the kind of access to credit people have. The ability to have young Black female entrepreneurs in the future is going to be about how the formal banking system, I believe, in South Africa changes the approach and is willing to lend. I mean, we see this group threatening to take the banks to the Equality Court now, because even with the bank guarantees, the banks don't want to lend to small Black businesses. We see very slow uptake. I think it's only about 13 billion of the 200 billion loan guarantee scheme that was part of the debt relief. And so, yeah, so I think, you know, thinking about improving and meeting demand, and the role of demand, not as a short-term but a long-term thing in a path-dependent economy, in shaping our policies and towards provision, redistribution, but also credit is I think already 5:10, and we probably going to have time for discussion. So I'm going to stop there, and if things come around back to discussion about economics and macroeconomics, I'm happy to come in later. But I think Deborah should take over again. Thank you, Eddie. Thank you, Deborah.
Well, thanks very much, Siraj, and thank you to all three of the presenters. It's been a wonderful introduction to the topic. An anthropologist, a practicing lawyer, and economist. And I think what emerges from Deborah's initial input is the blurring of the distinction of between formal and informal, but also from a debt in the way in which the law actually was very much part of this process of deepening inequality through those garnishing laws. And I think that it was nice to have Siraj end the introduction with a focus on policy. The theme of our series is law, policy, and inequality. And I think maybe we should now open it up to the House and have a question answer session. Let me take the first questions from the audience. Yes. Could we have any questions?
Yes, please, Eddie. I have a question.
Okay, thank you. Just quickly introduce yourself, Yanni.
I'm Yanni Rousseau. I'm the interim head of its business school. Now, Eddie, clearly the solution to this problem is not to make any borrowing by households and individuals in South Africa illegal. If we make all borrowing by individuals and households illegal, by definition, this problem will disappear. So one have to look, it's necessary to look for another solution. So is the solution to stop all store credit for a beginning? Make it illegal for furniture stores, clothing stores, etc., to give loans to customers, because it seems to me that that is a big part of the problem. We heard the remark about the cupboard being axed. So I agree that making it illegal will drive such lending to banks, but it's much easier to regulate lending at banks than at furniture stores, because banks are regulated by the Reserve Bank. And at the same time, close all these cash loan shops that we see on street corners. Again, that will push people to banks, but it is much easier to regulate banks and to penalize banks. Thank you, Eddie.
Right. Thank you, Yanni, for that very specific proposal. Who do I have next? Do we have any questions put to the speakers?
Eddie, there is a question in the chat. I don't know if you can see that.
I can see a question here. Should I read it out?
Yeah.
While I admire and respect the research put into this, I can't help wondering what we have done to educate those affected by these atrocities. Where do we start in terms of trying to regulate lending, e.g. standardize interest rates? Maybe we could have a response from either Deborah or the two discussants to Yanni Rousseau's question and this particular question. Would you like to respond, Deborah?
Sure, I'll have a go. Thank you for all of those interesting points. It's great to have both the sort of story from the law side being more consolidated, and also admitting that the law maybe has certain shortcomings when it comes to really tackling this thing at source, but also great to have some insights from a macro economist who also recognizes that there's been a financialization of everyday life, which is pretty much the kind of thing I've been talking about myself. I think that in a sense there are some big solutions that might be pursued. But in a sense, those big solutions often seem to fly in the face of various kinds of commercial interests, and that is why they're often very hard to actually instantiate. And I think that the people who've got ideas about solutions to this range from the ones who want to kind of put in place a more benign, if you like, proper type of capitalism, and that would be Clark Gardner, I think, and his Summit Financial and his Q-Link and his various other companies, all the way through to people who want to sort of, you know, completely upend the way that it's operating right now, and whether, you know, find ways of tackling it far more at source, and sort of undermining not just the indebtedness problem, but all the other things that go along with it. So in terms of the kind of what you might call a more moderate, a kind of reform rather than revolution approach that people like Gardner suggest, he talks a lot about the fact that what subjects people to these problems of insecure or unsecured lending, or at least allegedly unsecured lending, since in fact it's not really unsecured at all, as I pointed out before, it's either underpinned by a salary from the government, or otherwise it's underpinned by the state welfare grants. But what does kind of subject them to, if you like, the most raw form of expropriation and if you like, accumulation by dispossession, is the fact that so few people have maybe real property that they own, which in a kind of good capitalist world is supposed to form the basis of your ability to take out loans at far lower forms of interest. So one way of tackling this has been suggested would be to give, you know, ultimately to restitute property to those from whom it was taken away, because if they did have secure title to property, they would be able to use that as a collateral instead. I don't really know if that is a workable solution, but it certainly seems to be one option. And then as to the sort of solution that Yanni proposed, that was an interesting point. I think the problem really in South Africa partly lies in the fact that there's just not enough muscle being put into the regulation of these various processes. And so, you know, although the law and some activist lawyers and human rights lawyers have really done their bit in terms of trying to close loopholes every time they crop up, the actual idea of having a much more kind of regulated overview such that you could really make various forms of lending illegal and direct people towards other forms is something that doesn't seem to be in sight. And when you look at some of the places that I went to doing this research, you really are talking about marginal communities that are literally like fish in a barrel, waiting to be sort of shot, if you like. There's just no sign anywhere of sort of debt, let's call it debt advisors. I've been looking into debt advice in Britain, and it is a fairly robust process. You can really come in if you're a debtor. I mean, I'm not trying to kind of hold it up as a great example, but you can come in. I've sat in on advice sessions and I've seen people phone up, you know, like 20 different creditors and persuade each of them. My client can only take, you know, can only give you like R2 a month. They're going to get R2 a month for the next 40 years. Take it or leave it. Those kinds of things obviously require a huge amount of effort, finance, and a lot of time, but they can make a difference, albeit at a very small scale level. It's the big scale stuff that I find a bit more difficult to get my head around, because I think you're looking at trying to sort of, you know, tackle an entire system, and that's not just the debt part of the system. It's every part of a financialized neoliberal type of capitalist arrangement.
Thank you, Deborah. Adet and Suraj, would you like to respond specifically to the idea of standardizing interest rates and Yanni's suggestion of banning loans at stores?
Suraj, you're the economist, so you shoot away.
I mean, I think, you know, in terms of standardizing interest rates, I mean, it's interesting given the context of what's happening now, and sort of you know, South Africa itself being seen as high risk and having been downgraded and having to sort of pay a premium on lending to us, whether it's in rands or foreign currency. And sort of, I think our banks treat people the same way. And I think also there's a bias in the lending. And so, and I think it's be really hard to sort of convince government as it is now to shift towards sort of much tighter regulation of lending and interest rates. I mean, it's something I would like to see, you know, and sort of saying, you know, let's look at amending or getting rid of the sorry, I forget the name of the act from the 80s, or bringing back sort of kind of the usury type laws. But yeah, I don't have much more to say than that. On Yanni's idea with the furniture and stores and the clothing stores, I mean, as Deborah was saying earlier, a lot of them have become financialized, you know, and set up financial subsidiaries or you know, companies attached to them, and to some extent, I think a lot of their profits are coming from those companies. So there'll sort of be I think a very huge backlash from them. But also, you know, their subsidiaries may then shift to becoming different kinds of financial institutions that still service those. And just on an aside, sort of thinking just on Steinhoff, you know, Steinhoff, a lot of the fraud and misallocation of money came through sort of saying we're going to be servicing this poorer section of the community and have this future income from debt and hire purchase and all kinds of things, and then basically creating sort of a huge amount of fraud out of it. So maybe Yanni's suggestion is a good one, given that it may also limit the possibility for that kind of fraud. But yeah, but I mean, what could also happen is that people would have, if you needed to buy, say, a refrigerator, would have gotten store credit, would now shift towards other micro lenders, and we're not sure if they'd be better or worse off in that case. But I mean, people who need to borrow money for certain things would sort of then shop around and look for where they can get access to credit. So that may be one solution, but it doesn't, I think, solve very much of the problem. Maybe I'm going to stop there. I don't have much more to say on that.
Yeah, can I just add something there?
Sure.
Just an important point to note, which is kind of what Siraj was referring to, is that the Usury Act was revoked in the 90s, and it was part of an explicit attempt, A, to liberalize the economy, and B, to open up the supply of credit to those who'd previously been denied it. And boy, did it ever do that, but with unforeseen consequences, I think. So that's an important thing. And can you kind of put Pandora's box back and shut the lid again is the question I would ask.
Right. Adette, do you want to respond at all?
Yes, sure. You know, at first blush, I very much like Yanni's suggestion, because it just, you know, it appears to be streamlined. It appears to be simplistic, and I think the only sort of issue sort of against it is that on the one hand, one has you know, hugely powerful invested players. This is a hugely lucrative, these are hugely lucrative markets. And on the other hand, what one lacks is any community organization around the issue of affordable credit, properly regularized credit in South Africa. So, you know, if we could have a movement like we had with, you know, around HIV medicines for credit reform in South Africa, that would be a thing. But it doesn't seem to be within the remit of any particular grouping. So certainly, you know, I think trade unions have thought about it, but they, you know, they always have other major issues on their agendas. And so one's really left with the, you know, Black Sash, which is a really, really small organization, and maybe one or two other small civil society organizations that work in this field, but it's really very, very small. And so, you know, without that sort of community voice, without that community activism and organization gaan ons maar soos gewoonlik speel.
Dankie. Okay, let's. I had Michelle. Did you had a question?
Yeah, thanks, Eddie. It's Michelle Williams from Sociology. So thanks to all the speakers for this, I think, really interesting conversation. But I wonder if we're looking at it, I mean, debt is, to me, we have to see it as an epiphenomenon, a result of the crises of neoliberal capitalism and the ways in which financialized capitalism has rooted itself in, you know, I mean, who is it? Crouch, who talks about privatized Keynesianism. Basically, you've taken away the state and the public goods, and you've made individuals entirely responsible for so many of their needs. So debt is a reflection of that. And so I liked Suraj's comments around other goods, basic income, and all these others. But I'm also wondering, you know, regulating debt to me, and even just people's consumption, misses the point. Shouldn't we be talking about cooperative banks? I mean, places like Italy, India, places that actually have vibrant cooperative banking systems actually provide really good types of loans, both for local level community development, collective goods, but also for individual needs. But then we have to locate that also within a larger discussion around public goods. And so I appreciate that these are the big picture issues, but I don't think we can, I think right now, there's both a structural and hegemonic crisis of capitalism. And right now, probably for the first time in 30 to 40 years, we have a potential to actually say, this isn't working anymore, and we have to think different and bigger. So I'd like to hear all the speakers reflect on like, what do we really need, not tinkering with the system.
Thank you, Professor Williams. Should do the panel want to respond to that question, or should I have a number of chat questions. One of them I think I'd like to put on the table, and that is that FNB has in the past been accused of charging high interest rates on loans to Black people. Is it then correct to say there's no discrimination in lending? Could this be one of the reasons why these backdoor loan sharks exist? Maybe could anyone on the panel respond to Michelle Williams's input and that question of discrimination against Blacks?
I can have a go at it. I can see another question earlier on as well, relating to the fact that informal lending happened long before the Usury Act was removed.
Yes, yeah, please respond to that, yeah.
Yeah, so all of that is true, and in my book I've tried to trace something specific about South Africa and its kind of longer term history, and especially trying to kind of get to the core of why it is that something that's been described as a very, very advantage to creditor legal culture exists in this country. So while I take on board the idea that this is just part of financialization in general and that everywhere is subjected to the same kinds of forces, I do think South Africa has quite a particular kind of background to this, and this idea that creditors are ultimately going to be to advantage has its roots in sort of the banking sector, you know, the late 19th century already. I think there's a lot of kind of stuff that we need to understand in the longer term. Another point to be made there is that, and this is something I picked up from a law professor at University of Pretoria, who talked about the fact that there was a culture here in legal terms whereby especially migrant Black people had gotten used to the idea that their finances were under external judicial control. And this goes its way all the way back to the kind of moment when mine workers were having some of their wages kind of kept and retained and not actually paid to them directly. There's a long sort of history whereby it's like, we have your best interests at heart, so we're paternalistic, we'll do what we think best with your money, it's not up to you to spend it. And I think there's something kind of specific about the whole South African background to this particular phenomenon that we're describing now, even though, of course, there is much that is shared right across the board. Although I agree that debt is a result of the crises of financialized capitalism, I also find it interesting the way that the specifics of indebtedness have been tackled by quite minute sort of conundrums or groups of people, including advisors, and this might be because of the research I've been doing. I've been sitting in advice sessions and listening to how people actually help their clients, and it's something which has been called by John Elster local justice. It's all about the conundrums which are faced by people having to do redistributive tasks in what you might call the nooks and crannies of the system. So not to say that I'm against the notion of trying to sort of reformulate capitalism right across the board. I feel that there's something important to be seen in the activities of people like that. And this is why I feel that lawyers like Odette and others of her type who've worked in these kind of ways, you know, often in very nitty-gritty manner, and often on very small, what appear to be very small issues, are actually delivering something quite significant. And every time, as I said in my talk, that one loophole gets closed down, another one gets opened up, but then those need to be closed down as well. I feel that there is a fight being fought, and it is an important one. And I think it might just be too easy to say, well, we've just got to tackle financialist capitalism across the world, which would be great if we could do it. But in the meantime, there's a lot of people suffering, and maybe something needs to be done about them as well.
Right. Thank you, Deborah. Would the panel like to respond?
Nothing specific from me right now.
Yeah. On Michelle's point about cooperatives and such, I think that's a really important point, and I think it could be a really important part of the solution to the problem, to change access to credit and to provide a sort of much a better and more secure and friendlier sort of face for credit, and it's something that should be supported by government and also, I suppose, given a different status to the big four, big five banks in the country, and yeah, I mean, thinking about even in the US, where you have credit unions that are really strong and big and widespread, you know, it shifts for workers. It changes the way they deal with money, manage money, also the way they see themselves in relation to their fellow workers and lending. And you know, there's actually ease. I mean, the banks have changed. They're no longer financial intermediaries that you read about in the textbook that basically take deposits and lend that money out for investment or projects and things. They become sort of fee earners. They do all kinds of other things, and they unsolved it, and they don't really manage their credit books. But within cooperative banks or others, there could actually be a real opportunity for that, and also it could be an opportunity for money to stay within a community. You think about the number of Stokvels that put their money into Standard Bank or Absa, those banks, and how much of that money that gets loaned to people in the community. You know, the savings of the communities are not spent and used for the communities, and they're not necessarily used for activities that help society or those communities either. So I agree with the view, and I think we should really, you know, do more research and work on that, and also get. I mean, I know government has given support, and now within the Reserve Bank, there's sort of an arm that works on cooperative banks and stuff. Honestly, I don't know enough about that, but it is something I would support. Thank you.
Thanks, Siraj. I think in a way that Siraj is responding to the question, and Michelle, that Kathy Albertine had down on the chat. Are there comparative examples of countries that have regulated and controlled banking better than we have? I mean, it seems as if, Deborah, that your current research in the UK would suggest possible ways of regulating credit in a better way than we are.
Yes and no. What I've discovered here, again, there's a huge crisis of household debt. And what I've discovered is that although to a large extent there has been a kind of successful attempt to help poor people who are in debt for credit card debt or to various kinds of lenders and who've sold it on, you know, it's a typical thing. I don't even know who I owe anymore because this debt was sold to somebody else, and so it goes on. And interestingly, what has been discovered is that at that level, in fact, there's been quite a successful attempt to sort of push back on some of those creditors, ultimately phoning them up and saying, look, you've got no option but to kind of enter a revised plan with my client because they can't possibly afford it. But actually where the crunch actually comes in the United Kingdom here is government debt. So a lot of people are in debt to the local authorities, and that's because they have, you know, they've got to pay their council tax, or what we would call rates. And it's actually there that that the debt will not be forgiven. And the reason for that is because we've had austerity for the last 10 years. So central government has pushed all of its kind of austerity measures onto local governments, and your local authorities seem to have no option but to start recouping the money from the poor people who live in there and to ultimately owe them rates. It's a far more formalized system, obviously, but the creditors that are the most unforgiving in the UK tend to be the local state asking for its rates and municipal services and so on, rather than, you know, these kind of fly-by-night shyster type money lenders. So it's an interesting phenomenon, but ultimately people are still in debt.
Thank you. We have a question that comes all the way from India. Ajuthra, writing from India, would like to add that there's been active effort to dismantle the cooperative banks, which have been the backbone of our rural economy as we speak. And she also was also suggested here that wouldn't you advise that money management should be a compulsory subject at school level to avoid all of this lack of money saving as adults find themselves in post-school?
Eddie, Kathy here, can I just insert COVID-19 into the debate? Because it strikes me that indebtedness in many countries across the world is going to skyrocket with people losing jobs and the decline in the economies. And the question is, are there systemic answers to individual debt problems? I mean, I know we can talk about debt relief across nations and countries and talk about forgiveness, debt forgiveness there. Is there anything we can do around debt forgiveness for individuals?
That's an interesting question, Kathy. Does the panel have a response to that?
I don't have the details at hand, but they I think it was about last year or so that there was a program for writing off debts. It was something initiated by the government, and I'm not sure how that went and who qualified for that. Yeah. And also, you know, how successful it was and what the impact was, and if it actually was of benefit to those individuals, or if it just allowed them to jump back on the hamster wheel.
Thank you, Odette.
Yeah, I'm afraid I don't really know enough about what's exactly likely to happen at this point relating to the epidemic, although I can't imagine it's going to be good. There's also another question here relating to the question of the big banks and how they relate to the smaller lenders and things. And again, I haven't really gone into that in any detail, but I do have an answer to the question about the Indian situation with the cooperative banks. A colleague of mine at LSE, Sohini Kar, has written some interesting stuff recently, which seemed to show that, especially at the level of micro lenders in local communities, there's something quite similar, something very sort of financial inclusion that's usually quite prejudicial to poor people going on in India as well.
Thank you, Deborah. Alex Bielefeld, do you want to expand on your question?
Hi there. Sure, I can do that. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, super. So basically what I was thinking about is that there are a lot of situations where you have sort of medium or small sort of size lenders that provide microloans. But ultimately the reason for their existence is to earn big banks' financial sector charter points, which then allows them to transact with government or with other banks in particular ways and win sort of contracts from, you know, wherever. But the point is basically there are a lot of policy instruments that incentivize reckless loaning or reckless lending to poor people. And I think that might be something that one might want to consider in this sort of discussion, because it's not always particularly clear that this is happening, because you will see a small lender acting as someone who provides microloans to people. But what is really happening is that that whole entity exists purely for the reason that it is there to get financial sector charter points. So there was just sort of something I thought I would chip in and ask if anyone's considered that, but I think it's something that might be worth considering.
Thank you, Alex. Does anyone have, Siraj, is it something that you could comment on?
Sorry, no, Eddie. I actually don't know anything about this. So.
Yeah, I've been asked about it as well, and I'm afraid as an anthropologist, the level of my grasp of this has tended to be sort of at the local level, but it would be an interesting thing to explore.
Yeah, I just thought it would be interesting, because one does sort of look at these things sort of in a vacuum oftentimes, I think, because the impact is like you said, is quite local, generally speaking. But the reason that that sort of the practices arise is very much not localized. So I think that there's something about looking at the localized sort of situation and then taking that back to sort of policy that is perhaps like really, you know, national level, or even yeah, and then to sort of say, well, what is the relationship between these two things? Because I think there's a very strong relationship between these things. Yeah.
Thank you, Alex. I think we're coming to the end of the webinar. Are there any further questions from the audience? If not, maybe I'll ask the panel for some concluding comments. Adette, would you like to say anything?
Yeah, thanks very much. I think just, yeah, wanting to just, you know, the point about how law itself can be an enabler for discrimination and for promoting inequality, and that, you know, so while the law can also be an instrument of change, it needs to go with, as has been said so often and so many times, it has to go with real community activism, organization, mobilization. Yeah, otherwise I think we're not going to see change in this particular area. But yeah, thanks very much for the opportunity to have been able to participate.
Well, thank you, Adette. In fact, our opening session was precisely on that, the way in which the coding of law can promote inequality. Siraj, would you like to make some concluding comments?
Thanks, Eddie. And I think the other speakers have made the point, but it's sort of the legal side, and even improving the provision of credit isn't going to solve the problem. I mean, this is sort of a problem that needs to be attacked from multi-sides, and it's linked to systemic poverty and mass unemployment and sort of the highest levels of inequality in the world. And with that, you need, I mean, I think you need the state to play a much stronger developmental role, and to look at how it's going to solve the problems of poverty and unemployment and inequality. And with that, things like the retail market and access to credit, or credit provided by retailers, the banking sector, cooperative banking, and others form part of a package of things that you do to deal with that. So I think this, and I agree with what people are saying. The sort of the credit problems are part of, or a symptom of the deeper problems. But I think it's also a problem that's been neglected for a really long time. I mean, I think it was Odette who referred to the debt relief program that DTI was trying to put in place I think they started talking about it in 2013, and the law was passed in 2019, and it was supposed to provide debt relief for people with 7,500 Rand income and below, or and also not debt more than 50,000. That's what I remember of the scheme. The last I checked was sort of at the end of 2019. And it seemed like the National Credit Regulator, and I may be wrong, so if anybody from the regulators there, forgive me, but it didn't seem that the institutional capacity had been set up to support that process, and the ability to apply and also to get that relief hasn't really been instituted yet. And maybe with COVID, these things have slowed down even further. But just thinking about the length of time it takes to actually get that kind of law enacted, and then sort of within that time not having the institution set up, and just looking at how deep things, and what Kathy's been saying, sort of things are going to get worse with COVID. There's this huge neglect of the disease of debt and increasing debt within poor communities, and the impact that has on communities, like other aspects of poverty, that governments are not, I think, adequately acknowledging and dealing with. So yeah, I suppose my answer is sort of, how do we build a developmental state? Thanks. And thank you very much for being part of this, and to Deborah and Odette as well for the valuable input. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Siraj, for participating. Deborah, would you like to make some concluding remarks and draw it together for us?
I think everything that's been said has been extremely interesting, and I like having this kind of broad-ranging connection between the law and the economy, and then the anthropologist, which is me. As I say, I never started out, well, as Eddie pointed out, I started out interested in migrant women and their music, and suddenly I find myself sort of writing about debt. It's almost just came to me as I started driving. I think I was driving around in South Africa listening to phone-in shows of about 10 or 12 years ago, and it was all about indebtedness. It was suddenly something that just sprang out of the woodwork and kind of grabbed me and almost took me without my sort of permission, as it were. So ever since then, I've been intrigued by the project, and both dismayed by it, but also recognizing that this is in fact a sort of outpouring of people's aspiration. It is not just about people being poor. It's also about people not accepting to be as poor as they once were, and actually trying to sort of move beyond that. And as I said, this is something that's been noted in a whole variety of different countries, from Chile through India to the United States, and you know, among poor people in many different settings. And I think that there are sort of solutions that have been proposed, and I think that often the kind of activities on a small level are as important as those that might be undertaken policy-wide, and certainly the state ought to play a much bigger role. But it's also about trying to sort of merge and coordinate different activities. So one of the most obvious examples in my own case study has been about the way that the Magistrates Court Act does not talk to the National Credit Act. They seem to sort of operate in completely different spheres. And then again, you get the different law cases that have come through in relation to social grants and social welfare. All of these things actually kind of connect together in very important ways, and yet they're often seen as kind of moving in different directions. But I think what is important is to try and reintroduce to people some sense of control over what they're doing, if that can be possible. And having these very technologized machine-like systems whereby money gets deducted from people, quite apart from the actual nature of the debt itself, that sense of sort of having your money just disappear out of your account without any say-so is one of the most disempowering things that I've come across in studying this area. And I think that is one of the sort of psychological effects of what's going on here. So maybe in the old days, you used to get into debt. Yes, there were money lenders long before the Usury Act, as somebody pointed out, but it was usually a matter of sort of asking somebody for a loan and then kind of a slightly more personalized arrangement. And it's now turned into this far more machine-like sort of technologized. Money just goes in and out before you've even recognized where it's going. And I think that that's one of the things that it would be good if it could be tackled and somehow brought back under individuals' control. And if there is a need for so-called financial education, I often feel that this is just a sticking plaster, but it might at least bring that sense of control back to people. And I think that is an important element.
Right.
So thank you very much to all of you, by the way.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Professor James, for your input here. I just wanted to conclude with just three observations. Firstly, some years ago, it must have been about 15 years ago, I was doing research on amongst mine workers on the Platinum Belt, actually in the Northwest. And I came, it was a complete surprise to me, a man gave me his pay slip, the miner, and he was due for 2,500 Rand for the month's work. And he actually got 10 Rand 18 cents after deductions. And I was quite struck by this, and it really set me thinking through this question. And you raised that point, Deborah, about Marikana and the implications of debt in actually driving the conflict that took place, and the massacre that led to in August 2012. So I think it's quite fundamentally important. But there is a second point that occurred to me, because Deborah, your focus is, as an anthropologist, very much on the microdynamics of the household, and I'm just a question that really interested me is how debt can fuel intra-household conflict. I'm thinking conflict around gender between men and women, and also age between the young and the old, and maybe a factor that could be fueling domestic violence. So I think that the question of indebtedness goes well beyond the question of inequality. It gets to the kind of ongoing violence and stress at the household level in South Africa. Well, I think with those concluding remarks, I just wanted to mention that our next session, this is the third in our series on law, policy, and inequality. And our next session, which will be in September, we're hoping to run these monthly, is going to deal with the question of new technology. You touched on that, Deborah, but only really in passing, that a lot of the mechanisms around this have been driven by new technology. And what we'd like to do in our next session is to explore the question of technology and inequality, the deepening digital divide, if indeed it is taking place, and the implications it has for law, policy, and inequality. So with those concluding remarks, I'll declare this webinar closed. Thank you. Cheers.
Thanks, Eddie. Thanks, Deborah. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah. Cheers, guys.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.